Hello, 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 hello. Welcome to Kernels of Truth, brought to you by Progress, Kentucky. We have got a very special episode for you all today. Thank you so much for joining us. First, we're going to cover the news of the week. We've got elements of the Louisville gun violence crisis. We got voting rights in Kentucky, and we got some big doings in D.C. that Mitch McConnell is working very hard to derail. Then we'll be joined by the staff ecologist with Kentucky Heartwood, Jim Scheff, for a discussion about Kentucky's wild forests and the management of the Daniel Boone National Forest specifically. Finally, we will wrap up with our call to action and events calendar. But first, are you ready to help turn Kentucky purple? We know our Commonwealth has some work to do if we're going to beat back the tide of bad politics and policy from Frankfurt. From the partisan gerrymandering we're staring at right now to keeping cities from enacting any gun safety rules or policies. If you want a Commonwealth that works for all of us, join Progress Kentucky. It's easy. You just need to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever you spend time on social media. Just make sure to like, share, comment on our content. If you like it, you're hearing in Kernels of Truth, give us a thumbs up, leave us a review, or share out the show. In fact, if you're watching right now, you should just hit like. Just like the show. That helps, jumpstart Facebook's algorithm. That stuff's really useful. Share the show with your friends. Do what you need to do to help get more eyeballs and ear holes tuned into what we're working on here, turning the state purple. So we're going to check in with our co-host currently. We're going to hear who you are, where are you, what does your protest sign say today? Because, of course, we're not a bunch of talking heads on the internet. We are a digital demonstration. So you got to have a protest sign if you're at a demonstration, right? You don't want to be that person that just shows up with your hands in your pockets. You got to bring the sign. So I'm Aaron. I'm coming to you from Childsburg, a lovely deed-restricted community in Lexington, really, really close to that urban growth boundary. And my sign says, natural lands are in your hands. I like it because it rhymes and it's thematic to our guest. Next up, Doug Price.
Good evening. I'm Doug Price. I'm coming to you from Harrison County, Kentucky. Daniel Boone visited here in 1783. My sign says, it ties in with what I'm going to be talking about tonight on one of our stories. Should convicted felons be allowed to vote?
You've posed a question. Are you looking for an answer? Because I've got an answer. I think we all have a good answer. But we'll hear more about that soon. So let's go ahead and turn to news of the week. We are very excited to have a number of important stories to cover. And I think what we're going to do is actually go right to Doug Price because he has got a great story that, is in keeping with his sign. Doug, what you got?
Okay. The title of the story is Former Felons. How much should it cost to get their voting rights back? The state Supreme Court is weighing the issue. They're hearing a case that had its nexus in 1998 when Frederick Jones of Louisville pleaded guilty to a felony theft charge. In 2018, he attempted to go through the process of expunging his felony conviction to obtain his right to vote, and he claimed indigent status. At the time, the total fee to have a record expunged was $500. Now it's $300. He qualified under state law as he was making under $1,000 a month. He filed suit, and the suit progressed from the original court to the Court of Appeals and finally the Kentucky Supreme Court. Mr. Jones' attorney is Michael Abate, and I expect his representation is pro bono work on behalf of the Louisville law firm he works for. Mr. Jones claimed that he could not pay the fee due to financial hardship. Robert Baldridge, attorney for the Commonwealth, noted that this is the law and it cannot be waived. AG Daniel Cameron filed a brief with the court. Cameron argued that an expungement is a privilege and so there must be a fee. Under state law, the fees are collected into an expungement fund that is divided among the courts, state police, prosecutors, and the state's Department for Libraries and Archives. The whole purpose of the expungement law will be frustrated if the agencies tasked with expunging felony records are impeded by a lack of funding. Justice Michelle Keller questioned Baldridge about the perceived impropriety of the fee. "We want you to make your life better," and the judge said, "Yes, you meet the criteria, felony record expunged, but yet there are these fees that go to pay back the very people who put you there. I'm just struggling with this." Baldridge responded, "Justice Keller, we all have to live with terrible laws that the General Assembly has written." There is some light on this real issue. Jones' attorney, Michael Bates, stated, "The question in this case is whether indigent litigants are denied their right to seek expungements simply because they cannot pay the fee prescribed by the General Assembly. This is a question of exceptional importance to thousands of Kentuckians across the Commonwealth who have completed sentences, are eligible for expungements, but cannot obtain them because they can't afford to file for one." Appearing on behalf of the state, attorney Robert Baldridge argued the expungement is analogous to a bankruptcy petition, which also requires a fee, but he agreed that such expungements are still a unique situation. The state's attorney continued by saying that even if there are issues with the expungement statute, the state must stick to statutory rules when enforcing it. In his closing argument, Bate made it clear that his client is not arguing for a constitutional right to expungement, but to be simply given fair access to such a remedy. "We are simply arguing in reference to the Constitution that if the legislature creates an expungement remedy, it cannot reserve it to the people who can afford to pay for it. I am not an attorney, but based on what I read, I think the Kentucky Supreme Court will rule against Mr. Jones. I believe this is something that should be addressed by the Kentucky legislature, and believe that an automatic taking away of voter rights should be an individual decision on every case where a felony is involved." Where does Kentucky stand in relation to other states? From the National Conference of State Legislators, the District of Columbia, Maine, and Vermont, felons never lose their right to vote, even while they are incarcerated. In 21 states, felons lose their voting rights only while incarcerated and receive automatic restoration upon release. In 16 states, felons lose their voting rights during incarceration and for a period of time after, typically while on parole and/or probation. Voting rights are automatically restored after this period. In 11 states, of which Kentucky is one of those, along with Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Tennessee, Virginia, 5 others, they lose their voting rights indefinitely for some crimes or require a governor's pardon in order for voting rights to be restored. They also face an additional waiting period after completion of the sentence. And of course, in Kentucky, you have to pay that $300. Why are convicted felons disenfranchised? Is it a method to stop people from committing felonies, or is it a method to keep a segment of society from voting? Does a person make a conscious decision not to commit a felony act because they might lose their right to vote? In my mind, the real question is, the crux of the problem is that should conviction of a felony also require removal of the right to vote? Back to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Doug. So it'll be interesting to see how the Supreme Court rules. Clearly, we are a little bit horrible. Kentucky is not a leading state in this area, unless it's in a restrictive way, I suppose. But I found it interesting. There are states that let you vote while you're while you're actually incarcerated. But here, it's like if you're a felon, you're dead to democracy. unless you take these kind of heroic measures, I suppose. It was great to see Governor Beshear, when he came in, basically restore voting rights for a ton of former felons. But yeah, that cost is absolutely onerous and a pretty significant burden. So do you know what the history is there? Like, why did it go from 500 to 300, Doug?
I think probably there was a legislator who thought that was exorbitant and proposed dropping it down to a lower amount. As I said, it was 500, dropped it to 300. I guess they thought that maybe everybody could afford that or make it more affordable. But I personally think it's just another tax. That's basically what it is, to raise funds for state agencies. State agencies are underfunded because the legislators don't approve funds. They don't enact tax reform and that sort of thing. So they got to figure out different ways to raise money. So I think that's what that fee is about.
Yeah. Well, it's, I think it's outrageous. And if we had a more enlightened, legislature, I think they would get rid of it. But as we noted, you got AG Dan Cameron talking about how, people got to pay that price, and we need to get some guidance from the legislature if we're going to do the right thing. And this legislature seems wholly unlikely to do anything that's, in the, kind of the interest of more voting, certainly, and for, specifically for former felons. All right, so I'm going to move on to a story that I've been paying attention to because I'm a little terrified about what's happening. This is, we know there's a lot going on in DC right now, even as we speak. The Dems are working on their kind of two-track efforts to pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill. Kind of these huge implications for our climate. So really, like, if you care about climate change and us acting on climate change, there is a very finite and closing window for the Democrats to do something commensurate with the crisis. And that window is closing right now, right? So this massive infrastructure package, the Build Back Better plan, plus the bipartisan plan, you can add those two things together, and it's like trillions of dollars, but it's amazing projects and programs to get us on the track for clean energy, whether it's electric vehicles, like we heard about this week with the governor's announcement about the Ford battery plant. Really big news for our economy here in Kentucky, but also really important for our environment, right? Because Ford becoming a leader in EVs really helps pay dividends, moving from internal combustion engines to EVs. But more of that work would be done if the Build Back Better plan actually passes. And what we do know is that there's clean energy, other clean energy elements in that package, and it's not going to pass unless something happens, right? Unless the Democrats have their act together and are able to get past the Republican insurgents here, because they definitely do not want it to pass. But right now it's like a matter of negotiating amongst the Democrats, right? So the Republicans don't really have a huge role in that piece, but there is also a very, very big story, with a significant role for Kentucky, right? So the debt ceiling. Our politicos, Mitch specifically, is having a huge public role in putting our country on track for a complete financial meltdown. The debt ceiling is a big problem. It's one that is looming. It is one that how does the debt ceiling work? Well, we actually have an explainer that hopefully we can put in the chat right there for you. And I know people don't like it when we share Washington Post articles because you have to have a subscription after a certain number of clicks. But this one is a gift link. So everyone should be able to open it. So it's a really good explainer of what the debt ceiling is and how it works. But what we know is that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen estimates that on October 18th, the U.S. government is going to run out of money, right? And we will not be able to borrow more money. We will not, our debt is capped, and we're running out of money. So that means we won't be able to pay our bills. We won't be able to, pay Social Security to seniors. We won't be able to service our debts. Really, really bad news. The federal government also runs out of money at the end of September. A related and the solutions run through the Capitol and need signature from the White House, but Congress needs to pass a bill to fund the government by tomorrow, or we could have a government shutdown. The government shutdown is different than the debt ceiling. Just so look at that Washington Explainer link because it is a little bit confusing. But what happens if we, hit this debt ceiling and we don't have the ability to borrow money on October 18th when the country can't pay its bills? This is from the Washington Post. Moody's Analytics found that a prolonged impasse over the debt ceiling would cost the U.S. economy up to 6 million jobs. Wipe out as much as $15 trillion in household wealth. That's you and me, folks. And send the unemployment rate surging to roughly 9%, where it's right now at about 5%. So lawmakers in both parties agree the debt ceiling must be raised to avoid economic calamity, but their standoff over how to do so has intensified. Despite the national debt increasing by close to $8 trillion under President Trump, Republicans have been adamant they will refuse to help Democrats increase the debt ceiling in opposition to President Biden's spending plans. All right, so that's insane, right? Let's just say that. So the Republicans under Trump got the debt ceiling up to the debt to $8 trillion. That is clearly a lot of money. And that was his tax cut, the $2 trillion tax cut for corporations and for the wealthy. It was a lot of military spending, all this stuff added up. And the Democrats, and in the spirit of bipartisanship and the spirit of, yes, we incurred this expense, we need to pay our bills. The Democrats, raised the debt ceiling, I think 3 times under Trump. And unfortunately, now Mitch McConnell, being the crass partisan that he is realizing that one of the best ways for his party to have any role to play is by stopping the Democrats from being able to increase the debt ceiling. It's really insane. Senate Dems now this week have tried twice to address the debt ceiling, but Mitch has blocked their efforts. So he's not only stopping Republicans for voting to support the measure, but he's actively filibustering the Democrats' efforts. It's outrageous. And as if you just heard, it's incredibly dangerous. But why is he doing it? Why is he breaking with historical precedent and endangering our economy? Well, politics, of course, but specifically it's election politics, right? He wants to be able to whack Democrats unmercilessly on TV about out-of-control spending. He doesn't want to provide any cover whatsoever. And I think he's gotten it exactly wrong. He thinks this is a winning political hand for him. But I think the reality is people will see the fallout of his brinksmanship on the economy and this debt ceiling. And they're not going to, they're going to blame him. They're going to blame his party because we need to tell that story, right? So, look at these headlines. Mitch McConnell blocks Democrats' attempt to raise the debt ceiling on their own. With government shutdown at stake, Mitch McConnell plays chicken with Dems on the debt ceiling. An opinion piece in the Washington Post. Mitch McConnell needs to stop playing games with the debt ceiling. Every kind of opinion writer, that is in the kind of middle to the left side sees what Mitch is doing as a just craven and cynical political ploy. And we are, absolutely going to pay the price for it if he doesn't back down. But who knows, right? I think this is how we actually can get to filibuster reform. I think his move is so crass, so transparent, so dangerous. The Dow dropped 500 points yesterday, in part because of the jitters about Mitch's partisan brinksmanship. That's real money that really affects people. And it's really important that people keep it, a laser focus on why this is happening. He is not, he is filibustering the Democrats' efforts. The Democrats have enough votes to do this alone, to increase the debt ceiling. Okay, fine, Mitch. If you don't want to let any of your Republicans vote to do the responsible thing and pay for, Trump's tax cut, that's all well and good, I suppose. But the fact that he's filibustering it means they have to get to 60 votes, which is, impossible if none of the Republicans will do the responsible thing and increase the debt ceiling. So it's infuriating right now. And as I said, 3 or 4 times, it's incredibly dangerous. We need to hold him accountable. We need to put pressure on his office, call his offices, do everything you can. But I think he's overplaying his hand. I think I don't think he's right on this. And I think he's going to pay a political price as this gets worse and worse. But we'll see. He's a pretty cagey guy. He's got a history of 100 years in office and, getting things pretty close to right all the time politically. But I'm very thoughtful that, my thoughts on this is that he is going to pay a price, but only if we make him. only if we keep the focus on him. So I feel like that's why we're covering the story now. He has a role to play. Let's hold him accountable. I don't know. Doug, what do you think?
Yeah, Mitch. Mitch is very well known for talking out both sides of his mouth. If it helps him, he's out of the left side. If it helps him, he's out of the right side. It doesn't really matter. I want to mention something a little bit different, but along the same vein. Take Mitch and the Supreme Court justices. He wouldn't allow Obama's nomination to go forward because he wanted to wait for the election. And then when Trump was really going out of office, he rushed Trump's nominee very quickly and said the current president should do it rather than waiting for the election. So, we know who Mitch is. He, for some reason, though, we continue to reelect him. I have one similarity with Mitch. I wasn't born in Kentucky, but I believe I probably have lived in Kentucky longer than Mitch, even though he's got several years on me. But hopefully this last election was his last run for a Senate seat. He controls his agenda, and he doesn't care about anything that gets in his way. He's a great orator, too. Here's a quote from the new book, Peril, by Woodward and Costa. Trump calls Mitch. Mitch, he was asking him, how do you feel about Kavanaugh? Mitch said, I feel stronger about Kavanaugh than mule piss. Trump said, what? Mitch, in Kentucky, nothing is stronger than mule piss. We ought to stick with him. So because of the scent of mule piss, Kavanaugh was appointed to U.S. Supreme Court. Again, I lived in Kentucky, I think probably longer than Mitch McConnell. And I can honestly say I've never had the opportunity to smell mule piss.
I did not see that one coming. I'll be honest. All right. So, and of course, Mitch's rank hypocrisy and insincerity, that's all well known. And Doug, thank you for reminding us about his actions in the Supreme Court and confirming Supreme Court justices, his very loose and ever evolving rules. He also now he's absolutely been a huge fan of raising the debt ceiling. We've got some wonderful quotes that we've shared on social media from 2019, when of course it would be incredibly irresponsible for anyone to let the debt ceiling expire, but now of course it's a whole different situation because he's got power. All right, so we're going to do one last story, and it's one that Kimberly wanted to make sure that we covered, so we're going to cover it, and it's about gun violence in Louisville. And then we're going to get to our guest, Jim Scheff from Kentucky Heartwood. But first, we're going to do this story because we all saw, I think last week, the child shot at the bus stop. Kids lined up to go to Eastern High School. 3 children were shot. One, the 16-year-old junior Tyree Smith, was killed. There were reports of problems previous to this incident at this bus stop, and there wasn't any police response. The mayor has promised answers and, for the person or people responsible to be held accountable, which is all well and good. But, this is a very challenging situation. The mayor has, we want the mayor to, follow through on that pledge. But there's a lot of unsolved murders, a lot of unsolved murders in Louisville. And I don't know why this one is going to be a lot different. Obviously, it's outrageous and it's heartbreaking. What we saw immediately is a lawmaker introducing legislation for gun safety in Louisville. And that's actually, folks in Louisville want to pass some rules, some protections. Unfortunately, Josie Raymond, who represents the 31st district, she's requested a bill draft that would allow Louisville to regulate guns. And they've tried it before, she said, but this time they need to succeed because for the kids. So it sounds good. Like, okay, Louisville's got a problem with illegal guns and gun violence, but there is a statewide preemptive gun law that makes it basically impossible to pass anything that would limit gun access in any city in our Commonwealth. That's an NRA championed bill. A lot of states have these preemptive gun laws. because they saw what happened in Chicago and learned from that, right? So where Illinois was like, well, we like guns. Chicago was like, yeah, we want to get rid of them. And that has created a lot of headache for, gun manufacturers and gun sales. Chicago is a big market. So they wanted to stop any other state from going down that road or any city from going down that road. And so we got these preemptive gun laws. Kentucky is the only state that makes violating a preemptive firearms law a criminal offense, though. That's according to the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. And this is a problem we have got to deal with. 21 kids and teens have been killed in Louisville this year. That's more than the 16 killed last year when the city saw a record high 173 homicides. It just brings up how bad it is in Louisville right now. According to FBI data and other sources, Louisville is in the top 10 for murder rate increases. But murder rates have risen relatively uniformly around the nation, some by 30%. Overall, we've seen a 30% increase, which is, terrifying. Louisville definitely, isn't doing great. But there are cities in the region with a much higher murder rate, from Cincinnati to St. Louis, Detroit to Chicago. Those are all significantly higher than the Louisville rate. They were 46th most deadly city with the 2019 data. And that was 14 murders per 100,000 residents. But again, the 7th highest increase in homicide rate during the pandemic. So we have a lot of problems in Louisville. We need more solutions. I think it's, I'm sorry to say that it seems very unlikely that Josie Raymond's efforts will pass, given that it has to go through Frankfurt, and those super majorities, of Republicans in the Senate and the House are going to block anything that, smells of gun safety. But there are some regulatory approaches. Friend of Kernels of Truth, Christopher 2X, he's actually on Capitol Hill today, sharing his Future Healers effort. So kids that have been traumatized by gunfire in their neighborhoods, you're being connected to surgeons and other healthcare professionals, kind of for mentoring, for support, to give folks a vision of how to, get out of the communities that are most affected by gun violence. So really, I think some positive stories to point to, but there's just so much more that needs to be done and could be done if we had, again, sensible lawmakers in Frankfurt. That seems to be a narrative for tonight's show. If we had some of those folks, that's been a challenge, right? All right, Doug, any thoughts on that story?
Just a quick comment. I want to relate what is going on with this issue, to the COVID pandemic. During this time, the Republican legislators were fixated on doing anything they could to defer Governor Beshear's efforts. Mask mandates fell by the wayside, and the Republicans were promoting that local school districts should be able to make local decisions. So on that basis, can we expect new laws from the Republicans that allow local communities to make their own laws related to guns? Back to you, Aaron.
I think I have an answer for you, Doug. I love the analogy, though. That is a wonderful analogy. All right, so we are going to move on now. We are going to talk to. Thank you, Betty. Yes, sensible lawmakers in Frankfurt. That is an oxymoron. There are some sensible lawmakers in Frankfurt. Unfortunately, they're in the minority or super minority party, and they don't have a lot of access and influence to actually getting bills, hearings or votes. All right, so we are going to wrap up news of the week. Thank you so much for checking in. We are going to get on to our interview with Kentucky Heartwood's Jim Scheff. But first, remember, folks, if you like what you hear on Kernels of Truth, please consider supporting our efforts with a financial investment. That sounds impressive. A financial investment. We have a goal of raising $1,500 for our current organizing project. We're still less than 20% of the way there, so please do think about kicking in if you want to help turn Kentucky purple. We've got just 409 maybe days until we've got a chance to fire Rand Paul and celebrate at his retirement party, which is exciting. If you want to help make that possible, please make a donation right now. It doesn't have to be big. Anything you can do absolutely helps. Go hit us up on ActBlue. It's a secure website, and make a donation to help support our campaign to turn Kentucky purple. All right, so now we're going to move on. Bring in Jim Scheff, who is the staff ecologist at Kentucky Heartwood. And Kentucky Heartwood is a group that I've been hearing about for a while. They are, I think, as our friend Nate likes to say, they are the kind of the Lorax for Kentucky. They speak for the trees, and we're excited to connect with Jim, hear what Kentucky Heartwood is working on, and kind of what brought him to this fight for our forests. Jim, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron.
So yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, how did you get in this work? What does the work look like? We have this great picture of you measuring an oak, perhaps. I don't know, a birch.
Yes,
I'm not sure what that is, but
big white oak in an approved area that was approved for logging in Laurel County. I won't give my my whole life story here, but I've been involved in public lands advocacy for a little over 20 years. I was originally from Missouri, and I was really fortunate to have a lot of experiences as a youth in our public lands, especially up in the Northwoods and up in the Pacific Northwest and other places. And that really helped just create within me just a real affinity for our wild places. And I learned pretty quickly that our public lands really aren't protected. We often think of like national parks that are preserved for nature and for people to just simply enjoy. But what the truth is that our national forest lands really aren't that well protected. And as a matter of fact, logging and the sale of timber is a huge, if not the biggest driving force within the U.S. Forest Service. I came over to Kentucky in 2008. My wife was a volunteer on the board of Kentucky Heartwood at the time. And that's how we met, through sort of public lands advocacy community. And I've been with the organization for 13 years now. I spent most of the time as the director, but I've transitioned to more of a part-time role and getting to just use a little more of my science background and be out in the field and look at things out in the world and analyze projects. And we have a new director, Ashley Lipscomb, who has taken the reins of really directing the organization and dealing with all the necessary fundraising, and also just starting to tackle what's really become a whole spate of new projects across the Daniel Boone National Forest, as we're seeing a real significant ramp up of logging projects across the Boone.
So yeah, what is the state of the Boone, right? So it's our only national forest, right? As you said, national forests are not national parks. They are, there's a multi-use mandate for national forests. So there is, there's a planning process that will, tend to allow us some logging, under the right criteria, I suppose. So we expect there to be maybe some, but to be managed in a sustainable fashion, right? For the most good, for the greatest number, for the longest possible time, right? Is that the theory?
Yeah, well, real quick, we do have another national forest in Western Kentucky. Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area is actually a U.S. Forest Service unit. We've been involved with, over the years, with a number of former residents of what used to be known as Between the Rivers, working to stop the logging program over there. But most of our work has been in the Daniel Boone National Forest and continues to be. Back in the Kentucky Heartwood started in 1992, and back in the 80s and 90s, really all over the country, logging was just incredibly. There was an incredible amount of logging going on, just grossly unsustainable. And on the Daniel Boone, they were pushing up to 10,000 acres a year, some years. Just a huge amount of logging happening. And the Forest Service wasn't really even following the laws that exist during that time. So citizen activists got together, learned how the system works, and organized, and founded Kentucky Heartwood, really as part of a regional network of just activists just trying to figure out how to protect our forests. Because, I mean, frankly, our eastern national forests, and those in the Midwest as well, have never been a big priority for the large national environmental groups. So it really came down to just people in our area who love the forest, trying to figure out what to do and how to save it. And through organizing and legal work by the late 1990s, most of the logging on the Daniel Boone was shut down for several years. Since then, and until about the last 5 years, the amount of logging on the forest has been relatively small. Typically about 500 to 1,000 acres a year has been what's cut. Now, I know most people who think familiar with the Daniel Boone National Forest are probably familiar with the Red River Gorge. For a lot of people, it's just synonymous with that. The gorge is fantastic, but it also has a lot of good access, well-developed trails, campsites, and just recreational infrastructure. And to a lesser extent, and more people are going to areas around like Laurel County, where there's also more trail infrastructure. But the Boone is over 700,000 acres. And what goes on across the forest really is this logging program. And what's happened over the last few years is we've seen this just tremendous change from a pretty modest timber program to a very aggressive program. In the last 2 years, they've approved somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 acres of commercial logging. And the logging that they're approving on the Boone isn't, they like to use the term forest thinning, but it's not. These are what are called regeneration harvests, where about 90% of the trees in an area are cut. And this isn't to say that management is always inherently bad, but the effects on the ground on the national forest are, for the most part, pretty terrible. And some of the worst that we've seen and the worst that we're dealing with is in the Redbird District, which is mostly in Clay and Leslie counties. And it's an area that most people don't know about at all. There's really very little recreational infrastructure. There's the Redbird Crest ATV trail system, which is actually a really pretty trail system, but there's no campgrounds. There's not many trailheads. There's not much infrastructure down there. But it's a gorgeous mountainous section of the forest, but it's a place that people don't go very much. So the Forest Service has moved forward with some incredibly destructive projects there. So they approved this last year what's called the South Redbird Project. And in that project, they approved nearly 4,000 acres of commercial harvest on very steep and very unstable slopes. And we have been out in the field documenting the effects of logging on an adjacent project area just immediately to the north there called the Group 1 project that they've implemented over the past decade. And what we found is we found about a dozen major landslides caused by logging. The slopes there are very unstable. The hydrology, because of the coal seams, creates these pretty novel hazards that create a very significant landslide risk in that part of eastern Kentucky. And what the Forest Service does is on these very steep slopes, they bulldoze these skid roads back and forth, zigzagging across the slopes, just cutting these roads in, some of them with like 8-foot embankments on them. And then they strip most of the timber, so there's just nothing holding it together. And what we found is a lot of those skid roads end up being completely carpeted in invasive species. And after several years, as the roots from the trees that were cut die back, and when we get these intense rain events that we get almost every year now, we've documented landslides, several that are several hundred feet long and dumping huge amounts of sediment and debris in the streams. One of the landslides we found was over 1,000 feet long. And beyond just sort of the broad problems of dumping mountainsides into streams, it's not good. In the South Redbird Project in particular, most of the streams provide what's called critical habitat for the Kentucky arrow darter. And what that is it's a designation under the Endangered Species Act. The Kentucky arrow darter is considered federally threatened. Most of its habitat, it's endemic to the upper Kentucky River watershed, and the best streams that it remains in are in the Redbird District and in the project area. So some of the individual watersheds, maybe 600 to 1,000 acres of logging just in individual small watersheds. And if you can imagine a bunch of landslides dumping into those streams, it could just be absolutely devastating. And I mean, that's just the beginning of things we've uncovered out there. One of the more upsetting things that we found actually is that the Forest Service insisted that there's no old growth out there. And what we found through a lot of field work, a lot of combing through over 20,000 pages of documents that we got through the Freedom of Information Act, as well as conducting some scientific research in concert with some researcher at Indiana University and others. We've discovered some forests out there that are old growth, full of trees, 250 to over 300 years old. And so far we found about 50 acres of forest that's over 250 years old has been approved for logging. And the Forest Service says none of it's old growth, but it is verifiable old growth. In fact, it's part of what we've uncovered recently as we've been exploring more of it. In the Elisha Creek watershed, we found what's really one of the most significant old growth tracts in the state of Kentucky that the Forest Service says does not exist.
Why do you think, Jim, that's really interesting? So it seems like, logging's creeping up. Why do you think that's happening? Like, what are the forces right now? Is it like they just need to make their budget so they're like open to logging more? Like, what are the what's the motivation? You would imagine that, under a Biden administration, there's going to be a little bit less pressure on the Forest Service to turn out the board feet. But what's your read on that?
The Forest Service, it's a longstanding institution in which managing the forest for timber outputs is sort of a very narrow utilitarian view of the forest has been really a predominant feature for a very long time. And while we typically see more aggressive pushes towards getting more volume of timber out of the forest during Republican administrations, the fact is the people in the leadership all the way down to the line officers at the local level, these are career Forest Service folks, and they don't really change much administration to administration. We saw these numbers getting pushed up during the Trump administration, but sort of the seeds of that we were watching during the Obama years. And I don't have a lot of faith we're going to see a lot of change now. There's a lot of reasons why that's the case. And some of it's economic, some of it's policy, a lot of it's who the Forest Service employs, and a lot of it is just congressional budgeting. If you give the Forest Service money to work on trails, that's what they're going to do. You give them money to plan timber sales, that's what they're going to do. And the fact is, they don't really have much budget for recreation or management outside of anything that doesn't include just a huge amount of timber being cut. But philosophically, the Forest Service is dominated by people that see the forest really through an agricultural lens. So you'll hear a lot of foresters talk about how they're applying ecology, but the reality is that a lot of the lens that they're seeing the forest through is ultimately economic. So, for example, a not uncommon refrain and something we see in internal documents and even public documents is this idea that our forests here, once they get to about 100 years old or much over 100 years, are inherently going to die. They're diseased and declining and susceptible to insects, and it's just catastrophic if those forests aren't cut. We see that again, both sort of implicitly and explicitly in the Forest Service's documents. But the reality is, trees, forests start to develop old growth type characteristics after about 150 years in our area. Old growth forests, some that folks know, like Blant Forest, Lily Cornet Woods, and some other places, the oldest trees are well over 200 and some up to over 400 years old. So the average, age of some of our dominant trees is, 150 to 200 years old. And so there's this disconnect where the Forest Service sees really a declining value of trees as forest products as an ecological problem. And so it's really this mismatch, but the Forest Service carries it forward as if the economic value of a forest is synonymous with the ecological value of the forest. And that really, I think, confuses things tremendously. And it's a perspective that is frankly very hostile to old growth. It's very hostile to wilderness and preservationist values. And it creates a real problem where when we're entering good faith discussions with the Forest Service about projects and coming up with what are good ideas to manage for declining species and threatened species and important habitats and for old growth. How do we do that in an ecologically based way? Behind the scenes, all of our efforts and conversations, we find the Forest Service is just simply not acting in good faith, because when we come to the table talking about old growth, older forests, natural and wild areas, the Forest Service, frankly, thinks it's a bunch of just feel good nonsense, even though we have the science to back up our positions.
So they just disputed that was old growth, the stuff that you guys had identified, or they just didn't know?
Well, so the Forest Service does inventories out in these areas. So I'll give you an example of how we started finding some of this old growth. And we spent a lot of time out in the field looking at areas, and it can be hard. My background, I have 2 graduate degrees, but I studied old growth ecology at EKU. I studied how secondary forests become something like old growth. We call secondary old growth as for my master's thesis at Eastern. So I've spent a lot of time looking at this stuff. So the Forest Service, they do these stand exams where they go out, they assess what's in a unit, usually in like 20 to 50 or 70 acres, and they have these data sheets that have different species, sizes, and they provide what they call a stand age. But the way they do that is completely unscientific. So, for example, when we were going through all these, just again, 20,000 pages of documents, we started going through their stand exams and started seeing things that just didn't add up. So, for example, this unit in the Elisha Creek area that was approved for harvest, we found that they said the stand was, I think, 93 or something like that years old, 90-something years old. They cored 3 trees, and we found in the data, and one of which they said was 164, 165 years old, one of which was, I think 90 something, and one was 50 something, and they averaged it and said the stand age was 90 something years old. And so there's age thresholds in their standards and the rules that they have to abide by for assessing if something's old growth. So basically, if it's older than 130 or 140 years, they're supposed to take a deeper look at it if they intend to log it. And so what they did was they artificially dropped the age by averaging different age trees in what's a multi-age forest. So we were curious about that tree in particular, because it might have been indicative of actually an older forest. And so we went out and assessed it visually, and then we worked with a dendroclimatology researcher from Indiana University and went out and we cored a number of trees out there and found that not only were most of the trees there 250 years and some over 300 years old, but we found the tree that they sampled that they said was 165 years old, and that tree was over 300 years old. They went on the field, they cored it, they looked at it, and these are not big trees in some of these areas. So in that stand, this 300-year-old tree is about 16 inches diameter. It's a dry site. These are gnarly old trees. And so they're coring the tree, they're miscounting the age by almost 100%, and then they're averaging that with younger trees to say that the forest isn't old growth, and they sort of hide that in the data. So then when we get the data or look at the project, they just say there's no old forests out there. So that's just one example. There was another stand that we looked at that they did drop from their harvest plan that, or some earlier older data they had said might be over 135 years old. So we had looked at it visually and said it looks like it really does look like old growth, has a lot of the structure that we would expect for that forest type. And so we asked them to take a deeper look at it. And they responded and said that they had cored 2 black oaks and that were 65 years old, that the older age was an error, and it was therefore not old growth. Well, we went out and we cored, I forget how many trees now, it's been a couple of years, but I think we cored 14 or 16 trees and of different species, and most of them were 150 to over 300 years old. And the Forest Service dropped that from logging for ostensibly other reasons, but still refused to admit that it was old growth. So it's really what we thought was just a few errors, and I could go on, but it's really a pervasive problem where not only is the Forest Service using really bad methodology to assess if things are old growth, they are actively, misusing and hiding data to state that forests are just simply not old growth when they are.
Well, that is just really disappointing to hear, right? Because, the Forest Service, you would hope, is managing our national forest for the greatest good, and that's not. Logging is one management tool, but clearly in a place like the Daniel Boone, especially, more and more we're realizing the value is in fact having wonderful, beautiful places for people to go to that are also great habitat. So speaking of old growth, I'm going to throw it to Doug Price to ask you a question about the Daniel Boone.
Gee, thanks, Aaron. Yeah, just a thought. Is it about the money? Does the Forest Service receive funds when they're allowed to, I don't know, go in and develop that this area should be cut? And is it something to do with funding?
The funding mechanisms within the Forest Service are pretty opaque and complex. So under older rules, they would sell the timber. Some of that would come back to the forest and some of it would go back to the Treasury. But the money that would come back to the forest would be used for mainly for fixing up logging roads. So they'll say, well, we're going to use this money to improve watershed conditions. But the reality is that money just gets used to build new logging roads and fix old logging roads for the logging project, and then they walk away from them. Now they're starting to use these what they're called stewardship authorities. And this was another thing that we found through the Freedom of Information Act that was going on. The Forest Service has not disclosed at all. We've uncovered that the Daniel Boone National Forest has been meeting secretly and privately with hunting organizations to push more logging on the national forest. And what we found was that the Forest Service had been working on South Redbird, and particularly with the Ruffed Grouse Society, to basically give the timber from the project, millions of dollars of timber, to give that timber to the Ruffed Grouse Society. And then they get to sell the timber and then use that money to manage the timber sales, do road work, and also do some non-commercial work that sort of ties into their habitat management goals for the game species that they prefer. The Forest Service hadn't disclosed any of this. And in fact, one of the last stages of the approval of a project like this is called a pre-decisional objection. It's like a quasi-legal administrative objection. And it's very strict about the criteria you have to use to be able to have your objection to be eligible. We submitted one. We're very careful to follow the rules. And what we found out was that the Ruffed Grouse Society had submitted an objection, and they did not abide by the required rules. These are required by law, but the Forest Service accepted it. And they allowed the Ruffed Grouse Society to come in and argue that there actually needed to be twice as much logging, that at least 20 to 25% of the project area needed to be logged. And in our negotiations with them, they let the Ruffed Grouse Society argue with us that our alternative proposals for managing for different habitat types and also trying to mitigate risk for these landslides was just not economically feasible. What neither the Forest Service nor Ruffed Grouse Society disclosed during that meeting was that they were many months along in negotiations and developing contracts where Ruffed Grouse Society was going to be given the value of the timber in order to manage the project. And what we're finding is we believe that it appears that this sort of process, working with groups like Ruffed Grouse Society and the National Wild Turkey Federation, and we also think possibly actually Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, is happening forest-wide, where the Forest Service is looking really to transfer a lot of management over to these organizations by giving them the timber value to then turn around and use that value to do the work that is the priorities for those hunting organizations.
Wow. One other quick question. Is Miguel's Pizza really the best?
I'm going to get in trouble.
Ooh.
I'll just say I haven't eaten there in a while. I used to go there a lot. And honestly, I actually don't even go to the Red River Gorge very much these days. I go up there to rock climb now and again, but the fact is there's so many people going to the Red River Gorge. The impacts of recreation in some areas in the forest have gotten to be pretty severe. And generally, it's great for people to get out in the forest and get to learn about the forest and love it. I mean, these are our public lands. People aren't going to want to protect them if they don't know them. But we are seeing a lot of problems with areas becoming very degraded because of too much use. And it's tough because I love being out in the forest. I love rambling off trail and finding things. But more and more people are enjoying those sorts of things. And, we can go out and, you can go out and not leave trash and not spray paint, but it doesn't mean we're not having an impact. I mean, we all do, and it really adds up. So it's, managing recreation is a big challenge and a big problem, exacerbated by the fact that the Forest Service does not have the money to really manage the trails and access that we have, much less develop more so that people can recreate, across more of the forest in a more dispersed way. It might be, one thing if, say, they planned a timber sale and that money could be used for trail work, but, I wouldn't necessarily approve of that, but that's just simply not how it works, unfortunately.
I did want to make sure that we asked the question that Betty had shared that Doug, I think, was queued up. Like, have you guys got any comment on that resort area proposal for the Daniel Boone? It sounds like obviously where they are now with your current concerns about managing recreation, building something that's going to bring a ton of more people in, kind of is in the opposite direction of what you're advocating. But yeah, let me hear your thoughts.
I mean, it's tough, right? That development's on private land, so there's not a whole lot that the public can do to influence how that's done. The fact is, the Red River Gorge is not that big. People like to talk about Gatlinburg and development around, the Smokies and how all that works. But, down there, you're looking at, hundreds of thousands of acres of public land adjacent to Gatlinburg, whereas I don't have it in front of me, but the Red River Gorge is, tens of thousands of acres. It's not that big of an area, and it's already the amount of visitation is already more than the area can handle. So bringing more people there, it's not going to be good. The Forest Service has put together a plan to manage recreation possibly better in the Red River Gorge, but the fact of the matter is they put together a plan a decade ago and they haven't really enforced it or really followed it because they just don't have the resources to do it. So we can talk about creating more sustainable trails, better trailheads, ways of permitting and dealing with too many campsites, et cetera. But even the best plans without adequate funding are really just going to fail. So yeah, I'm really concerned about it. You can still go out there on a nice, a rainy winter Wednesday is a beautiful time to be out in the woods. But I certainly wouldn't go out there on a nice Saturday in the fall.
Yeah, it can get a little packed. So Jim, you and I offline, I think you're gonna have to send me some places I should check out. Maybe I don't want to get the word to spread though.
Yeah, I've gotten more tight-lipped. It's tough, so for example, a lot of folks are probably familiar with the Kentucky Waterfalls, Arches, and Landscapes Facebook group. It's really, really popular. It's a huge group, and I know the moderators. They work really hard to protect sensitive areas and promote conservation. But through social media, that page and others, you see things like there's a place in Laurel County, Pine Island Double Falls. It's a lovely waterfall. These two falls coming down. It was off trail, And we've started looking at it actually because the Forest Service had planned logging around it. We actually got the Forest Service to drop a logging unit that is used for, a lot of people would use to bushwhack access into there. In the last 2 years, people have just developed their own trails, and there's even signage that people have put up to go out there. Now, there's no official trails, but I see pictures posted all the time. And 2-3 years ago, underneath the waterfall, it was very delicate, and it was just carpeted in this greenery of lichens and liverworts and mosses. And now it's just mud. And it's not because of people coming to, pump their trash or, spray paint all over the place. It's just lots of feet going to a place that can't really handle it. And it was just as simple as a few people posted pictures of a really gorgeous place. A couple people figured out where it is. More people shared it. And then you just start seeing it on Instagram and Facebook just several times a week. And even got put on Google Maps and things like that. So, we're in an era where, social media has created, had some really damaging impacts on public lands all over the place. And that's just a whole conversation in and of itself that really is happening all over the country.
For sure. Well, hey, Jim, any final thoughts you want to leave our viewers with about how they can be involved or how they can support your work?
Yeah, Kentucky Heartwood, we're a really small organization. We have 1 full-time and 2 part-time staff, and we cover a lot of ground, a lot of projects, and the workload is increasing dramatically. And so we really are sustained by our members and supporters. I mentioned the work with Redbird. We're still working on that. We're doing a ton of work to try to turn that beast in the right direction, but that is not the only large logging project, that's recently approved or in the works on the Boone. And so you can find us on Facebook, Kentucky Heartwood. Our website is www.kyheartwood.org. It's easy to join us. You can get on our email list to stay updated on things. You can follow us on social media, which is great, but we've learned the algorithms like to toggle our stuff down a lot. So we do recommend get on our low volume email list, and we'll let you know when things are coming up and how you can help.
All right. So yeah, we did share in the chat a link to the website. You can join them as a member, or you can just give them your email address so you can find out what they're working on. But as we've just heard, it's really important stuff, and they could really use the support. So Jim, thank you so much for the time and that great information that you shared with us. Really important stuff.
Thanks for having me on here, and I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right, so we're gonna move on to our action events calendar. Very excited. Some great stuff to share with you. That's happening right now around our region. So just gonna find it. Hold on 1 second. All right. So we have joined the Kentucky Voting Rights Coalition. It's an association of groups committed to ensuring that previously incarcerated people reclaim their right to vote. And they want more citizens across our Commonwealth registered and voting in every election. So they've got some events coming up. One specifically next Tuesday, they have their Lexington meeting. So we'll put that in the chat if you want to get involved and support their efforts. Next Tuesday, a virtual meeting. And then coming up fast and furious on Saturday, Planned Parenthood has a rally for abortion justice and access in Louisville. That also is something we will share in the chat. More information about how you can get involved. This is associated with the Women's March, the kind of March for Reproductive Justice. There's an action in Louisville that you can take part in with our friends at Planned Parenthood. And the Kentucky Democratic Party has launched Ready to Run, which is a training program for potential candidates and staff, and that's giving them building blocks to win Democratic campaigns right here in Kentucky. There's a session coming up November 13th through 14th. I think it's in Louisville. You can head to their website, at the Kentucky Democratic Party to learn more about it. And then finally, we've told you about this petition a few times. We have a very important petition to urge the Kentucky Board of Medical Licensure to investigate the unethical and dangerous medical advice that's come from Dr. Rand Paul. we are very, very close to our goal of 500 signatures. Like we're like really spitting distance of 500 signatures. So if you've not signed yet, please sign. If you've not shared it yet, please share it. If you have signed and shared it, share it again. There's a great article about at least 50 complaints have been filed with this board. And they are taking well, he's a politician, so we don't need to, we can't regulate his speech. He's not a doctor, but he is a doctor. He is a doctor, and he is giving people bad medical advice. So we need to hold them accountable for that. We need to put the pressure on them clearly. And your signature could help us greatly in doing that. We'll also share that link in the chat. So, from me, Doug, and Kimberly, who was, had some stuff come up and couldn't join us this evening. We are very glad that you've joined us tonight. Next week on Kernels of Truth, we're going to be talking with the Kentucky Teacher of the Year. He's from Montgomery County. His name's Willie Carver. Started a Gay Straight Alliance group at his school to provide support for folks who didn't think they had any. Really interested to get his perspective on what students and teachers are going through right now in kind of COVID year 2. Progress Kentucky is a non-profit organization registered with the Kentucky Secretary of State. We are organized as a 501c4. We're affiliated with the Indivisible Project and the Commonwealth Alliance Voter Engagement, or CAVE. Our goal is to educate, organize, increase voter turnout, and advance a progressive agenda through civic engagement. Some graphic content was provided by Couchfire Media. Couchfire Media ignites multi-camera live stream, educational, and commercial video production content. You can find more information at their website, couchfiremedia.com. Production this evening was by Annabelle Nagel, our very own social media chair. Thanks so much for volunteering to help get our live stream out to the people. Annabelle, you've done a great job. The Jones Report, our friend Kimberly Jones, is retooling, but it will be going live very soon, every Sundays, back at Sundays, hosted by Kimberly Cecil Jones and her friend Betsy Foster. You can find them on Facebook at the Jones Report Radio. And then, of course, thank you, Nate, for the theme songs. You can find more information and music at natosongs.com. And if you miss our weekly live stream on Facebook, don't worry. You can rewatch the shows and see our source links on Facebook and also YouTube. Or if you prefer not to see us, if you think we've got faces for radio, audio podcasts are available on Apple, Google, Spotify. And just today, I put them up on, Pandora and Audible, which I think is also Amazon. So really, anywhere you're getting a podcast, you should be able to find Progress Kentucky's Kernels of Truth. So pretty good stuff there. Thank you all so much for joining the live stream. And I think we are going to close it out tonight. But remember, do something kind for folks today. It doesn't cost you anything. It can really help somebody who's, having a rough day. So be kind, be thoughtful, put, other folks first. And that is, in fact, a direct message to the Republican supermajorities in Frankfurt. So, folks, have a great night.